All right, so quick recap. This is on your notes. I know you probably can't see this on the screen, but we just want you to remember as we close out this study, all of these things that we have been talking about. The gospel doesn't just save us, it is the means for our spiritual growth. We know that the Holy Spirit works in us through the truth of the gospel in order that He might work through us. And so that's a big part of the Christian life, to change us more like Jesus. We are saved. We put sin to death. We walk in the power of the Spirit every day to pursue holiness. We learn that because our new identity is in Christ, we do not have to pretend. We don't have to perform. Hopefully we understand the difference between the law and the gospel, understanding how that works and the changes that we see in the gospel. We avoid legalism and license. Remember we talked about that. We live in a constant state of repentance. We make sure there's no heart idols that we have built up in our hearts. And then the three areas we noticed the last 2 weeks, and we'll finish this tonight, three areas where we see the gospel at work in us that works itself out through us. One, the gospel propels us to live outward on mission. And so we see the world as a mission field. Last week, we noticed how the gospel empowers us to forgive. And then tonight's lesson as it finishes is that the gospel enables us to resolve conflict. And as you think about what that means in this last lesson, when I saw that and read through the lessons for this study, I was a little curious at that. This seems like sort of an odd way to end this lesson. What does this have to do, resolving conflict? What does that have to do with the gospel-centered life? What does that have to do with living and walking with Jesus and growing in our faith? And I understand now why it is, and we'll go through some of these things tonight, but we need to remember that spiritual growth, which is what this lesson is all about, what this series is all about, spiritual growth does not happen in a vacuum. Right? Spiritual growth happens in a context. It happens in an environment. It happens in a setting. It's not just something that happens randomly or accidentally. Where does spiritual growth occur? Does it occur, out in the woods by yourself, isolated from everybody else? Do you grow in your faith by yourself for the rest of your life? And when we read the New Testament, no. It happens within the context of relationships. Spiritual growth happens within the context of the church. Now, this doesn't mean that you can't grow in your prayer closet by yourself. It doesn't mean that you can't grow when you're on a spiritual retreat and it's just you and Jesus, or you're out on the water or out in the woods, or you're at some retreat or wherever it may be. But by and large, the majority of spiritual growth that takes place in your life happens within the church, the relationships. Not in an institution, but in the relationships that are found within the church. So it is not surprising that our spiritual growth, your spiritual growth, is very closely connected to the interpersonal relationships that you have with one another. Okay? It doesn't happen apart from that. It happens included in those things. And I think there's a little box on your handouts. Most of the times, oftentimes, when a Christian is not growing, it's because something is wrong in a relationship. Not 100% of the time, but most of the time. In fact, I want to say, and we could explore this, we don't have time. I want to say, 99 at least percent of the time, if there is stagnation in your spiritual growth, if you're not growing at all, there's been no spiritual growth in your life, there's something wrong in a relationship. And it's either your vertical relationship with God or horizontal relationships with one another. Usually the problem is in one of those relationships. And so this is one of the reasons why this lesson talks about this. This is why the gospel sends us out on mission. This is why the gospel empowers us to forgive others. It's why the gospel enables us to live in harmony with one another. And so we're going to look at sort of a case study in conflict resolution from Galatians chapter 2. So I want you to take your Bibles and I want you to go to this passage and look at, we're going to read this event that happened with or between Paul and Peter. Two icons, two legends, two main characters in the church and especially in the New Testament. That there was a conflict between these two believers, these two missionaries, these two very prominent leaders in the early church. So we're going to look at how that was resolved and a few lessons that we can learn from that. All right, so Galatians chapter 2, and let's look at verse 11. So this is Paul writing this, and he says, "But when Cephas," and this is Peter, Simon Peter, "when he came to Antioch, I opposed him to his face, because he stood condemned. For before certain men came from James, Peter was eating with the Gentiles. But when they," the men from James, these are Jews from Jerusalem, "when they came, Peter drew back, and he separated himself because he was afraid of fearing the circumcision party, fearing the Jews. He was afraid of what the Jews would say about him eating and drinking with the Gentiles." Verse 13, "And the rest of the Jews acted hypocritically along with him, so that even Barnabas was led astray by their hypocrisy. But when I saw that their conduct was not in step with the truth of the gospel, I said to Cephas," let me turn my page here. "I said to Cephas before them all," that's important. "I said to Cephas before them all, if you, though a Jew, live like a Gentile and not like a Jew, how can you force the Gentiles to live like Jews?" Okay? So here is a very public confrontation. Paul had a problem with Peter. Peter was doing some stuff he wasn't supposed to do. And Paul confronted him, and there was a resolution that happened there. All right, so there's some questions that you need to answer. Why was Peter in the wrong? Say that again? His identity? Okay. Yeah, what was...
We are human beings. Sometimes we have habits of having less.
Okay. Having bad habits? Yeah. True. Yeah, what'd you say, Charlie? Okay, he's showing favoritism. What was wrong about what he was doing? Or was he wrong? He didn't want to be seen. Okay. Okay.
He was interacting with Gentiles, but when other, I guess his brothers or other groups, he's all of a sudden I don't want nothing to do.
Okay, all that is true, which makes him a what? A hypocrite. A hypocrite. Yeah.
Wasn't the message for both Jews and Gentiles? And so why should we feel that way?
But you got to understand.
Yeah.
Peter was the apostle to the Jews, and Paul was the apostle to the Gentiles.
Okay, right. Right.
They finally came together.
Right. Okay, that's true. Remember, yeah.
Early on, though, so it was still looked down upon by traditional Jews, right?
Okay. What, eating and drinking with the Gentiles? Yeah. Right. Right. Okay, that's a big deal of what's going on here. Remember, the church is brand new, just started. Pentecost just happened. So you've got all these Jews who lived very traditional for their entire life. It was, if you're going to follow God, one, you have to be circumcised. Two, you have to follow the law. You have to be a good Jew. You have to do all the stuff that we've done for the last 1,400 years since Abraham and the Old Covenant. So they're in the church, and then you've got the exact opposite. On the other end of the spectrum, you have the Gentiles, who could care less about. These were people outside of the church. I mean, remember that there was such a there was such a dividing line between the Jews and Gentiles. The Jews hated the Gentiles, and Gentiles hated the Jews. The Jews looked on the Gentiles, they looked down on the Gentiles to the extent that Gentiles were not even allowed to go and worship in the same place that the Jews were allowed. The Gentiles had their own court. I mean, this was highly segregated. In your minds, think white people going one place and black people going to the next place. Okay, that's how segregated this was. And so now all of that has been taken down, and all these people are coming into church together. They're all in the same room. They're all in the same building. They're all in the same worship service. So they're trying to get along with one another. They're trying to figure out how to worship together. And Peter, like you said, Peter was afraid of what the Jews were going to say about him or think about him. So, he was buddy-buddy with these dirty Gentiles whenever they weren't around. But when these important people, these important Jews, maybe Pharisees, I don't know, but these prominent Jews came, he was afraid of what they're going to say. So yes, he was a hypocrite. He treated them differently as opposed to, and when Paul recognized this, he confronted him. Now, the second question here, what was Paul's motive? I mean, it made him upset. You can feel the tension. I opposed him face to face. Like I called him out in front of everybody. What was Paul's motive in calling out Peter's hypocrisy? Okay. Two things. Okay. Okay. Tainted his witness. Okay. Good. What else?
Exposed him.
Say that again.
Exposed him.
Okay. It exposed him. Sure. Right. Yeah. Do you think or feel like this was personal? This was a personal confrontation? Paul had a problem with Peter personally? Or do you think Paul had more of a problem with what Peter was doing? Okay. And it got personal because there was, yes. So Paul's motive is not, hey, I don't like Peter and what he's doing. Paul's motive was, you are hurting, Tick said it, you are hurting the unity of the church. You are tainting the work of the gospel. You're causing a problem by playing favorites and being... so Paul's motive was purity. This is not the way the church is supposed to behave. And so it was less personal and more than it was more corporate for the church. Number 3, was Paul justified in confronting Peter? Why or why not? Okay. I think he was. Evidently, this is something that Paul recognized as this could have far-reaching, disastrous consequences. Here we are, we're trying to figure out how to get along. Here we are that Ephesians 2 talks about there used to be a dividing line of hostility between the Jews and Gentiles, and because of what Christ has done, that dividing line has been removed. So that there are no longer two groups. Now there's one group called Christians. We're not Jews and we're not Gentiles. We're Christians. And so he recognized if we don't stop this could be a problem for the church. All right. So there's some context there. I think I put that on your handouts. We've talked about this already. Some of the Jews still wanted to practice their traditions. And Peter knew the gospel. See, this is the thing. Peter knew better. Peter knew the gospel well enough to know that the Gentiles did not need to be good Jews in order to be part of the church. Peter knew that. But yet he didn't live like that. So Peter spent a lot of time worshiping with them, fellowshipping with them, eating with the Gentiles, and then distanced himself. And basically he was a hypocrite. What happened? Was this an event that just involved Peter? Right? Who else started?
What about the group of Gentiles that he was talking?
Right?
How did they feel when he just
Right?
did a turnaround on them?
Right? Yeah. Barnabas is named in this. Barnabas saw what Peter was doing and go, well, I must, that must be the way I need to live. So he started doing, and we've got to be mindful of this, that the purity of our conduct together, your conduct affects everybody sitting around you. My conduct affects everybody around us. We are not lone rangers in the church where we just get to sit off secluded and isolated and say, well, I'm just going to live my life and do my thing and I'm not hurting anybody and nobody needs to know about it. No, when other people see the way we live, it affects the entire church. Paul teaches this in 1 Corinthians 12 about the body. We're a body. If I cut my right finger off, my whole body's going to know it. If my left foot doesn't work, my whole body's going to know that. So our actions greatly influence the one another, the relationships that we have with one another. So Paul saw how dangerous and destructive his behavior was, so he confronted Peter. So let's think about these three things really quick. There are three elements of a biblical model of conflict resolution that we learn just in these short verses about how to resolve conflict with one another. And the first one that we see is there is a personal confrontation that happened here. All right, a personal confrontation. Paul approached Peter publicly. Okay, he didn't do it privately. We'll talk about that in a minute. But Paul confronted Peter publicly. Notice that Paul did not avoid Peter. Paul did not have a meeting about Peter. Paul did not try to, I need to talk with the deacons about what Peter is doing and we need to come up with, he didn't do any of that. He didn't try to bully Peter. He confronted him by going directly to the person that he had a conflict with. There's a lesson in that. That we go to those people. We sit down with those people. We don't talk about them. We don't gossip about them. We go directly to those people. In this particular instance, the confrontation was public because the sin was public. Okay, this is being done in front of everybody. This is why Paul confronted him publicly, because the sin was public. Everybody could see what he was doing. However, in most cases, I think it's very wise that the confrontation needs to be private. You going directly to that person or them coming to you or whatever conflict is, it needs to be done privately. But it's only from the two parties that are involved in that. So most conflict can and should be resolved privately. In some cases where it can't be resolved, there are steps. Matthew 18 gives us some steps about how to do this. There are people that can serve as a mediator. If you got two people that just cannot see eye to eye, and there's then a third party, a mediator can come in and sit down and help resolve that. But the lesson here, the model is that Paul went directly to Peter. All right, he didn't gossip about him, didn't talk about him, didn't post on Facebook about, whatever. Like, he went directly to him. I remember a situation that I had with somebody several years ago, and it was a huge conflict, and it was causing some problems. It actually involved me and them, and they thought that I said something that I did not say. And I don't want to go into the details of that because this is going to go online, and I don't want to disparage any of them if they or happen to see this. But they clearly misunderstood me, because the thing that they said that I said was I would never have said. It was so completely. Anybody that spent 5 minutes with me would tell you, Andy Moore doesn't talk like that. Like, that's not something Andy would say. And so we sat down and tried to resolve that as best we could. That conflict got so bad, they left the church. I mean, they went to another church. They They didn't want to be a part of our church anymore. But in that situation, I didn't call a business meeting. I didn't preach a sermon about it. I didn't go online and talk about it. And I also didn't avoid them. I went and knocked on their door and said, can we sit down in your living room, just the three of us, and can we figure out how we can resolve this and get this right? And I remember, I'm not ashamed to tell you, I remember weeping in tears, begging them to forgive me if they thought I said that, because I never would have said that. They clearly misunderstood me. But face-to-face conversation, that's what Peter and Paul are doing here. If it's a public problem, it needs to be a public correction. All right, but the example from Paul is that he went directly to Peter. He had a personal confrontation. All right, so the second thing that we see is that there is a pure motivation. Okay, this is the second question that you answered earlier. Paul's motivation, this is important. Paul's motivation was not self-defense. Okay, he wasn't attacked. It was not self-interest, as in it had something to do with Paul personally. Paul's motivation was the defense of the gospel. Okay, and we see that in verse 14. Look at verse 14 again. When I saw that their conduct was not in step with the truth of the gospel. This is his motivation. The gospel is at stake here. The church is at stake. The crucifixion and resurrection of Christ is at stake. All right. This was not personal for Paul. This has to do with the gospel. Paul was not motivated by his personality differences with Peter, and they were very different. I think both Paul and Peter were probably type A guys. They're very bold. They're very courageous. Peter's the one that took out the sword and cut off Malchus's ear, and Peter was not aiming for that dude's ear in the garden. Peter was trying to cut off his head. Peter's the one that said, hey, I'll go anywhere with you, Jesus. I'll die for you. He was the only one that got out of the boat. Right? Peter was a bold, braggadocious, Paul was like that too. Paul was humbled, especially when he talks about his thorn in the flesh that God gave him to humble him. But we can say this loosely. Don't take this the wrong way. Here's how to sort of think about this loosely. This was not personal. This was business. Okay? It was the business of the gospel. It was the business of the church. That's what Paul was motivated by. So Peter knew the gospel. He believed the gospel, but he was not living out the gospel. In the minute, in the conflict that we have in our lives and relationships that we may encounter, the minute that you make conflict more about you and less about the gospel, you are motivated by the wrong thing. Conflict cannot be about something personal. It has to be something that, because if it's personal, you could just forgive that and move on. There's no conflict there. And I think this is important to see in the life of Jesus. There's a couple things I want you to think about. Think about this in the life of Jesus. What are two examples or two instances in the life of Jesus where he had a very strong confrontation with someone? And both of them, by the way, were public, very public. What are there may be more than two, but just there are two specific that I'm thinking about. What are the two major conflicts or confrontations that Jesus had in the Gospels? Okay, that's it. Flipping tables, where he dumped the tables. All right. So the money changers in the temple. All right. And I think I put this up here already. His motivation was the purity of holy worship. So this is not Jesus flying off the handle. This is not Jesus losing his temper. This is not Jesus. In fact, one of the writers that records it, and I can't remember which one, but one of them says that he sat aside and took the time to braid a whip. So here's Jesus, he didn't just fly off the handle. He saw what was happening. He stepped aside and he took, I don't know how long it took him to make a whip. And here's the Son of God flipping tables, beating people physically with this whip, driving them out of the temple. Okay, completely holy. Okay, but here was a public confrontation that his Father's house, the purity of worship in that temple, that was at stake. And so Jesus confronted them. The second one is a little harder maybe to think about. Can anybody think of a second one? There's a whole chapter. Okay, well, that's a good one. That's not the one I'm thinking about, but that's a good one. You talking about with the adulterous woman? Yep. Well, that was a public confrontation. He confronted them about their. Yep, that's good. I didn't think about that, but that's good. What else? Okay, that was another one. Yep. Yep, that's one. I'm thinking about the public rebuke of the Pharisees in Matthew 23. Remember, there is a whole chapter where Jesus stands up and just takes these men behind the woodshed, so to speak. And you can go, if you've never read Matthew 23, you can go and like Jesus he does the same thing with his tongue and mouth that he did in the temple with those money changers. He just destroys them. You brood of vipers, you snakes, and I mean, he just calls them out. And the reason for that, he had such a problem with these men because they were not living the kind of life that is modeled by the gospel. And so his motivation was a purity of holy living. So you look at that in the life of Jesus. You go back here to Paul and Peter. It was right, it was good, and I think necessary to confront Peter. This is not fun. Conflict, resolving conflict is not easy. But it's right, it's good, it's necessary when it's motivated by the right thing. So we have to be very careful. We have to be very careful to examine our motives. I love this. Confronting conflict cannot be emotionally driven. It must be spiritually driven. If you can't control your emotions because somebody, whatever, well, I'm not going to think about the specific details, but you've got to be able to talk to people in a way that is not, you don't take it personally, and you can't be emotional when you're dealing with conflict resolution. It needs to be motivated by something more than just you. Just, what people say about you or don't like about you or whatever personal it is. It needs to be spiritually driven. It needs to be gospel driven. I'll tell you why that is. And this has happened. I've been guilty of this. I've seen it happen too many times as well. If we are not careful with our motives, we can make a bad situation much worse. And so there is something, where's that part in James 2, James 3, that talks about, that you should be slow to speak, slow to anger, quick to listen. I'm just paraphrasing that. So if that means you got to walk away, if that means you got to go, to your happy place and spend some time with Jesus in the woods by yourself to get your emotions under control, then that's what you need to do. Because when we deal with conflict resolution, we can't be emotional about it. I think some good advice to do that. If you need to confront somebody, if you have conflict with somebody, number one, you need to pray and pray and pray. That's your first thing that you need to do. Spend a lot of time in prayer. I would encourage you to fast. I think that's a good time to fast if you need to go and confront somebody. I also think that you should seek advice from a third party. Somebody that knows some things maybe that you don't. Somebody that has some experience in dealing with conflict resolution. Somebody that can be honest with you and tell you maybe they can see something that you can't see. And you need that good friend to be able to help you to see that. Okay, so last thing, number 3. Here's the third thing that we see in this model is that there was a plain explanation. All right, and we see this in at the end of verse 14. All right, a very plain explanation here. Here's what Peter. Let's just read it again. What he said. I said to Peter before all of them. In other words, in front of everybody. If you, though a Jew, live like a Gentile and not like a Jew, how can you force the Gentiles to live like Jews? All right, so here's a paraphrase of what Peter is saying here. What Paul is saying here. Paul goes up to Peter and says, "Hey, Peter, you know what? You don't follow those Jewish rules anymore. So why are you expecting other people to follow them?" Right? That's what he's talking about at the end of verse 14. Right? If you're not living by those rules in your own life, you don't have any business making other people feel like they have to follow those rules as well. So here's a very important thing to remember in this explanation here. There's no beating around the bush. There's no airing of grievances here. There's no bringing up all kinds of things that Paul didn't like about Peter. Right? Again, this wasn't personal. There's no 20 different criticisms that Paul was pointing out. Well, you don't do this, and you don't do this, and you're terrible at this, and like none of that stuff was involved in this. Paul focused on the one issue. Okay, the one thing that was a problem. It was the only thing that, and he had a very plain explanation for it. This is why you need to think, you need to pray, you need to fast, you need to talk to others before you go in and sit down with somebody. You need to be able to have these things in your mind. Can you address that one issue? Not all these, maybe smaller things that are not that important. All right, one final question on here. What is noticeably absent from this confrontation? It's glaring, it's staring you in the face. Peter didn't argue. There's no response from Peter. Now, that doesn't mean that he didn't pitch fit and have his fit and all that, but I don't think he did. There's no response from Peter. And I think there's some clues, though, that tell us how he responded. Okay? And I think the first clue is the lack of response. The fact that Peter did not say anything. Nothing to indicate here he had any kind of response. It's almost like what happens when you're in the kitchen and you got your hand in the cookie jar and Mama walks in and finds you with your hand stuck in the cookie jar. What is there to say? There's nothing, like you're caught. Look, you're taste testing? You sound like you got some experience of that. Yeah. Right? You're guilty. Like there's nothing you can say. There's no excuses that you can make. The second thing, and I put these two scriptures on your handout, is Peter's comments that he makes after this. 1 Peter 2:12, keep your conduct among the Gentiles honorable. The same people that he was not acting honorably with. In Galatians 2, he says here, almost like he's thinking about the mistake that he made. Keep your conduct among them honorable, so when they speak against you as evildoers, they may see your good deeds and glorify God on the day of visitation. And then the third clue is what Peter seems to write about the appreciation for Paul's ministry. He had a lot of good things to say about Paul. 2 Peter 3, 15 and 16. Therefore, beloved, since you are waiting for these, be diligent to be found by him without spot or blemish and at peace. And count the patience of our Lord as salvation. Notice this, just as our beloved brother Paul. He also wrote to you according to the wisdom given him, as he does in all his letters when he speaks in them of these matters. There are some things in them that are hard to understand, which the ignorant and unstable twist their own destruction as they do the other scriptures. So here is Peter talking about how beloved Paul is, how wise he is. So there's nothing there that seems to indicate Peter had a grievance with Paul, or Peter didn't like what Paul did, or Peter had a problem with what Paul did. He was seemingly understood that was right and good and necessary to do that. So anyway, so some good, a good model there, a good way. Again, Matthew 18 is another great place where you can look at how to resolve conflict. This is a must for the church. The devil is constantly using that long, crooked finger to stir up and cause all kinds of division and chaos and disorder, and we just not going to let him do it. And the way we not let him do it is that we sit down. If me and Steve Rabin, we got some things to work out, then me and Steve Rabin going to go fishing. He's going to take me on his boat, and we're going to spend some time. And we're going to spend some time together, and we're going to make things right with one another. We're going to make things right with one another. Not that we have anything wrong with each other. All right? So we do that because that honors the Lord. It builds up our church. It adds to the unity of the church. And it's a witness to the world that looks from out there, looks in here and goes, hey, they treat each other a little differently in there. So, all right. Comments, thoughts, questions, anything you want to ask before we go?